relationship. Empathy is often misunderstood as simple kindness, being warm, caring, or emotionally sensitive. While those traits are certainly part of it, they barely scratch the surface. What truly defines an empath isn't just how deeply they feel, but how clearly they perceive. At its core, empathy is not softness, it's awareness. It's the ability to sense what exists beneath the surface of words, behaviors, and social masks without distortion or denial. This kind of awareness operates almost automatically. An empath doesn't have to search for inconsistencies, they notice them instinctively. When someone says they're fine but carries tension in their voice, an empath registers the mismatch. When words and emotions don't align, when energy shifts subtly in a conversation, or when something feels unresolved but unspoken, it doesn't go unnoticed. It's not about being suspicious or over-analytical, it's about being attuned to emotional reality in a way that most people are not. And this is where the deeper truth begins to unfold. An empath's light is not just comforting, it's revealing. Most people move through life managing their internal discomfort by avoiding it. They construct identities based on how they want to be seen, rather than who they truly are. They tell themselves stories that justify their behavior, protect their self-image, and keep deeper insecurities hidden. This isn't necessarily intentional or malicious, it's a natural psychological defense mechanism. It allows people to function without constantly confronting the parts of themselves that feel uncertain, unresolved, or painful. But these internal narratives require maintenance. They depend on selective awareness, subtle denial, and a certain level of emotional blindness. As long as those defenses remain intact, a person can preserve a sense of stability, even if it's built on incomplete truth. Now introduce an empath into that environment. An empath doesn't interact with those defenses in the same way. Not because they're trying to disrupt anything, but because they can't fully participate in what they can clearly see through. Their awareness cuts through pretense naturally. They don't need to challenge someone directly or call anything out. In fact, many empaths avoid confrontation altogether. But their presence alone, grounded in perception rather than illusion, can feel unsettling to those who rely on those defenses. This creates a subtle but powerful dynamic. When someone who is deeply invested in maintaining a certain self-image comes into contact with an empath, they may experience a quiet sense of being seen. Not in a literal sense where their secrets are exposed out loud, but internally where something feels recognized that they themselves haven't fully acknowledged. It's the feeling that someone understands more than you've revealed. And for many people, that feeling is deeply uncomfortable. What makes this even more complex is that this discomfort is rarely processed consciously. Instead of asking themselves why they feel exposed or what part of them is being reflected, most people instinctively look outward for the source of that unease. And the easiest place to direct it is toward the empath. This is why empaths often encounter reactions that seem disproportionate or confusing. There may be no conflict, no disagreement, no clear reason for tension, yet something shifts. A person may become distant, defensive, or subtly dismissive. From the empath's perspective, it feels like something changed without explanation. But the change didn't come from anything external, it came from something internal being activated in the other person. Another important layer to understand is that empaths don't just see beauty, they see contradiction. They see both the strengths and the inconsistencies in people simultaneously. This balanced perception can be grounding in healthy relationships, but in less self-aware individuals, it can feel threatening. Because being seen clearly means that both the admirable and the unresolved parts are equally visible. And here's the key point. People don't resent what they don't notice. They resent what reminds them. An empath's awareness acts as a mirror, reflecting back what others may not be ready to face. And even if nothing is said out loud, that reflection can create internal tension. For someone who is comfortable with self-reflection, this can lead to growth and deeper connection. But for someone who avoids introspection, it can lead to resistance. This is why being an empath can feel paradoxical. On one hand, your presence can feel deeply comforting, safe, and understanding. On the other hand, it can evoke discomfort, defensiveness, or even quiet resentment without any obvious cause. You can be both a source of ease and a source of tension at the same time, depending on the emotional maturity of the person you're interacting with. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it shifts how you interpret people's reactions. Instead of internalizing their discomfort as something you caused or something you need to fix, you begin to see it as a reflection of where they are in relation to themselves. Your awareness is not the problem. Your clarity is not something to dilute. And your ability to perceive deeply is not something that needs to be hidden to make others comfortable. It simply reveals what is already there. And not everyone is ready for that. When you carry a high level of emotional awareness, your impact on others goes beyond what is said or done. It operates on a quieter, less visible level one that people often feel but don't fully understand. This is why your presence alone can trigger reactions that seem confusing or even unfair. The key to understanding this isn't in your behavior, it's in how others process discomfort. Most people are not as self-aware as they appear. They navigate life through patterns, assumptions, and internal narratives that help them maintain a sense of identity and control. These narratives aren't always accurate, but they are familiar. They create a version of reality that feels stable and manageable. As long as nothing challenges that version, a person can move through life without needing to question themselves too deeply. But your presence disrupts that stability not because you're trying to, but because you perceive what others overlook or suppress. You notice inconsistencies. You pick up on emotional undercurrents. You sense when someone's words don't match their internal state. And even if you never say a word about it, that awareness still exists in the interaction. People can feel it. It creates a subtle pressure not from anything you impose, but from what your presence represents. Clarity. For someone who is comfortable with self-reflection, this clarity can feel grounding. It can even feel refreshing to be around someone who sees things as they are. But for someone who relies on avoidance or denial to maintain their sense of self, that same clarity can feel intrusive. It creates a moment of internal friction. That friction often shows up as a feeling of being seen in a way that goes beyond surface-level interaction. It's not about being judged, it's about being recognized more deeply than expected. And for many people, especially those who haven't fully confronted their own internal conflicts, that recognition can feel threatening. Now here's where the psychological pattern becomes important. Most people don't respond to that discomfort by turning inward. They don't pause and ask, why does this person's presence make me feel this way? Instead, they instinctively look outward for a cause. And that's where you come in. You become the most immediate and visible variable in their experience, so their mind assigns the discomfort to you. Not because you caused it, but because your presence coincided with it. This is a classic example of emotional projection where internal discomfort is externalized onto another person. This projection doesn't always look dramatic. In fact, it's often subtle. It might show up as a shift in tone that feels slightly colder or more distant, passive-aggressive remarks that seem out of place, dismissiveness toward your insights or observations, a sudden need to create space without clear explanation from your perspective. These reactions can feel confusing. You may replay interactions in your mind, trying to find what you did wrong or what triggered the change. But the truth is, the trigger was never something you did. It was something they felt in response to what your presence revealed. Another layer to this is that your awareness doesn't just highlight what's unresolved, it highlights what's inconsistent. People often present themselves in ways that align with how they want to be perceived. But when someone senses that you can see beyond that presentation, it introduces a kind of psychological tension. They may feel like they have to hold up their image more carefully around you, or they may feel like that image isn't fully convincing in your presence. Either way, it disrupts the ease they feel around people who don't challenge their self-perception. And when ease is disrupted, the mind looks for relief. Sometimes that relief comes in the form of creating distance. Other times, it comes in the form of subtly discrediting you. If your perception can be reframed as overthinking, too intense, or unnecessary, then it reduces the pressure they feel. It allows them to maintain their narrative without needing to question it. These labels are not accurate reflections of who you are, their psychological defenses. They serve a purpose. To protect the other person from having to confront something they're not ready to face. And once you understand that, their behavior starts to make more sense, not as something personal, but as something patterned. There's also an important emotional reality. Here, people don't resent what feels neutral to them. They resent what creates internal tension, and tension only arises when something meaningful is being activated. Your presence doesn't just pass through unnoticed, it interacts with what's already there beneath the surface. For some, that interaction leads to curiosity and growth. They may feel challenged, but in a way that encourages reflection. These are the people who lean into awareness rather than avoiding it. But for others, that same interaction leads to resistance. Not because they consciously reject you, but because they unconsciously reject what your presence represents. And since it's easier to distance themselves from you than to confront themselves, that's often the direction they take. This is why it's so important not to internalize these reactions. If you interpret every shift in someone's behavior as something you caused, you'll start to question your own nature. You may feel the urge to soften your awareness to be less perceptive, or to hold back parts of yourself in order to keep interactions comfortable. But that approach comes at a cost. When you begin to dim your perception to accommodate others, you disconnect from your own clarity. You trade authenticity for acceptance. And over time, that creates its own kind of internal tension, one that's far more damaging than the discomfort you might trigger in others. The more grounded perspective is this: your presence is not inherently triggering, it is revealing. And what it reveals depends entirely on the person you're interacting with. So when someone reacts with distance, defensiveness, or subtle negativity, it's not always a sign that something is wrong with you. Often, it's a sign that something within them has been brought to the surface, and they're not ready to deal with it. Once you understand that, you stop chasing explanations for every shift in behavior. You stop trying to manage how others experience you, and instead, you begin to observe those reactions as information. Information about their level of awareness, information about their capacity for self-reflection, and most importantly, information about whether they can meet you in the kind of connection you're capable of offering. One of the most misunderstood patterns in an empath's life is not just that they form deep connections, but that they consistently attract people who need them. At first glance, this can feel meaningful. It can feel like you're valued, trusted, even essential in someone's life. But over time, a subtle distinction begins to emerge, one that changes everything once you see it clearly. There is a difference between being connected to and being relied on. Empaths naturally create a sense of emotional safety. You listen without interrupting. You validate without immediately judging. You try to understand before reacting. These qualities make people feel seen, heard, and accepted, sometimes in ways they've never experienced before. And for emotionally healthy individuals, this kind of environment fosters mutual trust and balanced connection. But not everyone responds to that safety in a healthy way. For some, especially those who are emotionally overwhelmed, underdeveloped, or avoidant of self-reflection, your presence doesn't just feel safe, it feels like access. Access to clarity they don't have to develop themselves. Access to emotional regulation they struggle to maintain. Access to someone who can hold space for their relationship. Confusion without requiring them to confront it fully. And this is where the dynamic quietly begins to shift. At the start, it often feels natural. Someone opens up to you. You listen. You offer insight. You help them make sense of what they're feeling. There's a sense of purpose in feeling that you're making a real difference. And in many cases you are, but what often goes unnoticed is whether that exchange is balanced. Because while you're offering energy, attention, and understanding, the other person may simply be receiving it without developing the same capacity in return. In a healthy dynamic, this imbalance would correct itself over time. The other person would begin to grow, take responsibility for their emotions, and contribute more equally to the connection. There would be a natural shift toward reciprocity. But in an unhealthy dynamic, the opposite happens. The more you give, the more they come to expect. The more they expect, the more they rely. And the more they rely, the less they develop independently. Without realizing it, you transition from being a person in their life to becoming a resource. This is the point where appreciation slowly turns into expectation. What was once met with gratitude becomes something assumed. Your presence is no longer seen as something you choose to offer, it's seen as something that should always be available. And when that expectation isn't met when you're tired, unavailable, or simply unable to give it the same relationship level, the reaction can be surprisingly negative. This is where many empaths feel confused. From your perspective, you've been consistent, you've been supportive, you've shown up with patience and care. So when the other person becomes distant, critical, or even irritated, it feels disproportionate. It feels like a shift that came out of nowhere. But it didn't. It came from a pattern that had been building beneath the surface, a pattern rooted in imbalance. Another important layer to understand is relationship, the role of comparison. Over time, the person relying on you may begin to measure themselves against you. Your ability to process emotions, stay grounded, and offer clarity highlights a gap in their own capacity. And that gap is uncomfortable. For someone willing to grow, that discomfort can become motivation. It can inspire change, self-reflection, and development. But for someone who avoids that process, the discomfort needs to be resolved in another way. And that way is often reframing you. Relationship. Your strengths start to be labeled differently. Your emotional depth becomes too intense. Your insight becomes overanalyzing. Your consistency becomes too much. These labels aren't accurate. They're protective. They reduce the pressure of comparison by making your qualities seem excessive or flawed rather than something to aspire to. And as that reframing takes hold, the dynamic shifts again. What once felt supportive now feels exposing to them. What once felt grounding now feels confronting. So instead of appreciating your presence, they begin to resist it. This is one of the hardest realizations for empaths to accept. Some people are not drawn to you because they value who you are. They are drawn to you because they value what you provide, and those are not the same thing. Being valued as a person involves mutual respect, curiosity, and emotional exchange. Being valued as a provider involves utility. It's about what you can give, how you can help, and how you can make someone feel. This doesn't mean that people are intentionally using you. In many cases, it's unconscious. People operate from patterns they don't fully understand. They gravitate toward what brings them relief. And when they find someone who can offer emotional clarity, they attach to it. But unconscious behavior still has consequences. If you're not aware of this pattern, you may find yourself overextending again and again, giving more time, more energy, more understanding, hoping it will eventually create relationship balance. You might believe that if you just explain more, support more, or show up more consistently, the dynamic will stabilize. But it won't, because the structure itself is unbalanced. It was built on extraction, not exchange. So the shift begins with awareness. You start recognizing that constant need is not the same as deep connection. You begin observing how people respond when your availability changes, when you're not as accessible, not as responsive, not as consistently giving. Do they respect your limits? Do they adjust and take more responsibility for themselves? Or do they become frustrated, distant, or dismissive? That response tells you everything. Because people who value you will adapt to maintain the connection. People who value what you provide will resist anything that limits their access to it. And from there, your role begins to change. You stop trying to be everything for everyone. You stop measuring your worth by how much you can give. And you start recognizing that your empathy is a strength, but only when it's directed with intention. Because when giving becomes your identity, you don't just attract connection, you attract consumption. And without boundaries, that consumption turns into depletion. There comes a point in every empath's journey where awareness turns inward. It's no longer just about understanding others, it's about recognizing the cost of constantly doing so without limits. This realization doesn't arrive loudly. It's subtle. Gradual. You start to notice patterns you once overlooked, the imbalance in your relationships, the exhaustion that follows certain interactions, the quiet sense that you've been giving more than you've been receiving. And from that awareness, something begins to shift. You start setting boundaries, not out of anger, not as a reaction, but as a form of clarity. You begin to pause before automatically saying yes. You question dynamics that once felt normal. You become more intentional with your time, energy, and your emotional availability. And perhaps most importantly, you stop overextending yourself in situations where your presence is expected but not genuinely respected. From your perspective, this change feels grounded, necessary, even healthy. But from the perspective of someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries, it feels very different. It feels like loss. This is where the tension begins to surface in a more visible way. Because boundaries don't just change behavior, they redefine relationships. They shift the structure of how people interact with you. What was once open and accessible now has limits. What was once freely given now requires discernment. And not everyone responds well to that shift. Here's the critical truth. People don't react to boundaries based on whether those boundaries are reasonable. They react based on what those boundaries take away from them. If someone was used to having constant access to your attention, your emotional support, your relationship, patience, then even a small boundary can feel significant. Not because it's unfair, but because it disrupts a pattern they had grown comfortable with. And when that pattern is disrupted, it creates pressure. That pressure forces them to adjust, to take more responsibility for their own emotions, to manage their expectations, to operate without relying on you in the same way. But not everyone is willing or ready to make that adjustment. So instead of adapting internally, they push externally. Sometimes this push is direct. They may question your boundaries, challenge them, or try to negotiate around them. They might say things like, "You've changed," or "You're not as available as you used to be." On the surface, these statements may sound observational, but underneath them is an attempt to restore the previous dynamic. Other times, the resistance is more subtle. They might test your limits, seeing if you'll revert back under pressure. They may become distant or withdrawn, using silence as a way to create discomfort. Or they might shift into criticism, reframing your boundaries as flaws rather than healthy adjustments. What used to be seen as kindness is now labeled as inconsistency. What used to be appreciated is now questioned. And for an empath, this can create an internal conflict. Because you can feel the shift. You sense the tension, the discomfort, the change in how the other person relates to you. And there's a natural instinct to restore harmony, to explain yourself more clearly, to soften the boundary, to make things feel comfortable again. But this is where the real challenge lies. Every time you compromise a boundary to maintain someone else's comfort, you reinforce a dynamic where your needs come second. You send a message both to them and to yourself that your limits are negotiable under pressure. And once that pattern is established, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain any consistency at all. Holding a boundary requires a different kind of strength than most people expect. It's not loud or forceful. It doesn't involve proving a point or winning an argument. It's quiet, steady, consistent. It's the ability to tolerate someone else's discomfort without immediately trying to resolve it. It's allowing them to have their reaction, whether it's frustration, confusion, or distance, without taking responsibility for managing it. That's a significant shift, especially for someone who is naturally attuned to how others feel. But it is also where clarity begins to emerge. Because when you stop managing how people respond to your boundaries, you start to see the relationship more clearly. Their reaction becomes information. People who genuinely respect you may not love the change at first, but they will adjust. They will recognize that your boundaries are not rejection, but structure. They will meet you with a level of understanding that reflects their own emotional stability. But people who were primarily benefiting from your lack of boundaries will struggle. Not because your limits are unreasonable, but because those limits remove something they had come to depend on. And in that struggle, their behavior becomes more transparent. The frustration, the resistance, the attempts to regain control, it all surfaces. And that visibility is not a problem. It's clarity. It shows you the difference between someone who values you as a person and someone who values your availability. It reveals whether the connection was built on mutual respect or on access without limits. Once you see that clearly, your decisions begin to change. You stop trying to maintain every relationship at the same level. You stop over-explaining your boundaries in hopes of being understood. You stop negotiating your well-being just to preserve dynamics that were never balanced to begin with. Because boundaries are not about creating distance, they are about defining where you end and someone else begins. They protect your energy, your time, and your sense of self. They ensure that your empathy is given intentionally rather than automatically. And most importantly, they shift your role from being constantly available to being consciously present. There's also an important psychological layer beneath all of this. Boundaries introduce accountability. When someone can no longer rely on you to regulate their emotions or solve their problems, they are faced with themselves. Their habits, their patterns, their level of self-awareness, all of it, becomes more visible. And for someone who is not used to that level of responsibility, it can feel uncomfortable, even overwhelming. So instead of embracing that accountability, they may try to resist it by pushing against your limits, by reframing your behavior, or by attempting to pull you back into the role you used to play. But this is where your consistency matters most. Because the moment your no begins to disrupt someone else's expectations is the moment you step out of living according to them. And that's not something to undo. It's something to protect. Because boundaries are not a rejection of others, they are a recognition of yourself. They are a statement that your time, your energy, and your emotional capacity are not unlimited resources to be accessed without consideration. And yes, setting them may change how people respond to you. But those changes don't mean you've done something wrong. They mean you've finally done something different. And often, something necessary. There's a stage in an empath's journey that feels less like a decision and more like a quiet transformation. It doesn't arrive all at once, and it doesn't announce itself. It builds gradually through repeated experiences, through moments of exhaustion, through patterns that become too clear to ignore. And eventually, something shifts at a deeper level. Your awareness stops being something you use and becomes something you live from. At this point, growth is no longer optional. It's integrated. You don't just understand dynamics, you recognize them in real time. You don't just sense imbalance, you feel when something is no longer aligned. And because of that, the way you relate to people begins to change. You become more selective, not in a judgmental or superior way, but in a grounded, intentional way. You start paying attention to how interactions actually feel, not just how they appear on the surface. You notice whether your energy is being respected or simply received. You become, less interested in fixing, explaining, or carrying emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. There's a shift from constant participation to conscious observation, from reacting to others to responding with intention. And from the inside, this feels like alignment. But from the outside, especially to those who haven't undergone the same growth, it can feel like distance. This is where the tension deepens. Because your growth doesn't happen in isolation. It exists in contrast to the people around you. It highlights differences in awareness, emotional responsibility, and personal accountability. And for someone who is still operating in old patterns, that contrast can be difficult to sit with. They notice the changes. You don't respond the same way anymore. You don't engage in the same dynamics. You don't offer the same level of immediate access. And whether they can articulate it or not, they feel that difference. Now, for someone who is open to growth, this contrast can be inspiring. It can spark reflection. It can encourage them to evolve, to meet you at a deeper level, to develop the same awareness they see in you. But not everyone responds that way. For some, your growth doesn't inspire, it unsettles. Because growth requires confrontation. It requires looking at what hasn't been addressed, what hasn't been resolved, what hasn't been developed. And if someone is not ready to face those things, your evolution becomes a reminder of what they're avoiding. And reminders, especially the ones we didn't choose, create resistance. So instead of moving toward growth, they move toward reinterpretation. They begin to redefine your change in a way that protects their current position. Your calm becomes indifference. Your clarity becomes rigidity. Your silence becomes judgment. Your boundaries become distance. These interpretations are not objective, they're defensive. They allow the other person to maintain their identity without having to confront the discomfort of change. Because if your growth can be framed as something negative, then it no longer needs to be understood, it can simply be dismissed. And this is where resentment becomes more defined. It's no longer just about what you represent, it's about what you represent, it's about what your growth implies. It implies that change is possible. It implies that patterns can be broken. It implies that the limitations they've accepted may not be permanent. And for someone who has chosen consciously or unconsciously not to, change, that implication can feel like pressure. Not because you're forcing it, but because your existence contradicts their narrative. You become a living example of a different way of being, one that requires honesty, accountability, and effort. And when someone isn't ready for that path, the easiest response is not to follow it, but to reject it. Not always directly, not always consciously, but through subtle shifts. A lack of support where there used to be encouragement, a withdrawal of Enthusiasm or connection a tone that carries distance. Even if the words don't from your perspective, this can feel confusing at first. Because your growth was never about creating separation. It was about becoming more grounded, more stable, more authentic, but growth has a natural consequence. It changes the structure of your relationships. Some relationships are built on shared growth. Others are built on shared patterns. And when you move beyond those patterns, the connection either adapts or it dissolves. That's not failure. That's alignment. The mistake many empaths make at this stage is trying to maintain old connections while living as a new version of themselves. They try to bridge the gap by over-explaining, by minimizing their growth, or by slipping back into behaviors they've already outgrown. But that creates internal conflict, because you can't move forward while consistently stepping back to maintain what no longer fits. Growth requires consistency. It requires you to honor the changes you've made even when those changes create discomfort in your environment. And that takes a different kind of strength. Not the strength to endure imbalance, but the strength to accept reality. To accept that not everyone will grow with you. To accept that some people will misunderstand your evolution. To accept that being aligned with yourself does not guarantee being understood by others. And once you reach that level of acceptance, something shifts again. You stop taking their reactions personally. You stop trying to fix what isn't yours to fix. You stop shrinking to preserve connections that require you to be less than what you've become. Instead, you move forward with clarity. Because growth isn't just about becoming more, it's about becoming more honest. And honesty has a way of separating what is aligned from what is not. So here's the truth to carry with you. Your growth will not always be celebrated, especially by those who benefited from who you used to be. But that is not a reason to slow down. It's a reason to continue. Choose alignment over approval. Choose clarity over comfort. Choose growth even when it creates distance. Because the moment you start questioning your evolution just to maintain someone else's comfort is the moment you begin to abandon yourself. And that cost is far greater than any connection you might lose.